I've worked with a lot of IT professionals. Most of them, I would say, are very organized individuals, at least in their professional life. I would say the one thing that we all tend to slack on a little bit just as a collective group of individuals is some of our stuff related to tracking expenses and billing, right? Because that stuff's, well, it's a hassle, and there's usually not a very slick tech way to do it, although some of the smartphone apps these days are getting better. Now, if there's a way that we can, while we're doing our architecture and design, we can also take into mind billing and questions that are inevitably going to come down the pipeline about, what's this $22,000 charge for database and servers? Can you explain this, sir? If we can get ahead of that, so much better. In the case of Azure, we're talking about resource groups as being one of our handy ways of not only keeping track of our own expenses, but also helping keeping track of information for others that got to come along and follow behind our engineering mess. Let's talk about the impact a resource group has. Now, as we mentioned here in this past video, a resource group is one of the two things that every resource has to have, the other being the sub, right? We have to have a subscription, we have to have a resource group. Now, the subscription, this is the billing info, right? This is who is responsible, the individual or corporation or whatever it might be, as well as the actual payment info. I know one of the first things that I misinterpreted and misexplained to a CFO once was that the way we used resource group allowed us to control and, if you will, split the check on our expenses. And then he was immediately assuming that he was going to get like 50, 60 different invoices if we had 50, 60 different resource groups from Microsoft. And Microsoft, of course, said, no, you're getting one big bill, which we will bill you. We expect it all net 30 or whatever it is. And that's that. But once you pay that bill, going back and reconciling that to individual departments or projects, that's what RGs really can come in and shine. And if you're an intelligent architect, you take this opportunity to do this for your coworkers or peers in your organization and also look really, really awesome in the meantime by building this into your designs and plans from the get-go. So this means that our resource groups should be broken up into departments and projects? Yeah, maybe. Sometimes. Definitely sometimes. Not always. I hope this has been informative, and I'm kidding. I can probably be a little more helpful than that. Yes, you can absolutely use it for departments and projects. If you want the IT department, the accounting department, the human resources department, you want to put all their Azure resources in RG named after that department because that makes sense to your organization, do it. If you have a project within your IT department, you want to break up your individual services into projects, and each project has its own RG or group of RGs, and then that way you can keep track of it within the IT department. And is the IT department responsible for all the Azure bill anyway? Do it. That works for you. What about if you're trying to control access to data? Yes, no, absolutely a great reason to do an RG is for controlled security. Is to manage access, read, as well as the ability to modify or delete something. You're also going to see resource groups created for lifecycle purposes. Perhaps everything that's created within an individual project or process, maybe in a given quarter, is going to go into a specific set of RGs, and then at one point they're going to move on to an entirely other set, and that way they can adopt new procedures and become a little bit more flexible on their go forward without necessarily having to do that midstream on larger production projects. And maybe you're a bit smaller. Maybe all you're worried about is just kind of keeping track of stuff, right? Nothing wrong with just doing it by function. The small and simple reason, that's probably what most people do. It's really actually the most straightforward purpose of an RG. Put in the VMs over here and put the database servers over there and the application stuff over there. Sure, why not? If that makes sense to your accounting department, then go for it. But wait, one big, huge, giant caveat. When you pick a resource group, you have to put it in a region. When you put it in a region, sometimes that means that you have to put the resources in that region also. That isn't actually always true. You can assign resources to resource groups that don't exist in the same region. It depends on the resource, but there are circumstances where there aren't. So you need to pay attention to region when you put an RG out there, because we want to make sure that cross-region traffic is kept to a minimum. Why? Because that's the same thing as downloading. And downloading from Azure is an expense. That's a bandwidth charge. If you have two servers that sit side by side, for instance, up in the greater Azure cloud, And these two servers are going to communicate with each other every day. And while performance may not necessarily be super important, they're always going to be communicating back and forth, and they're always going to exist like this fashion. It would make no sense for you to have them in two separate regions just to accrue data bandwidth charges for something that could very well exist side by side. Make sure that when you're doing your RGs, we're considering the region we're putting them in, and if that's going to create any problems for our other projects or departments or how we're structurally organized as a business. Let's kind of draw this out a little bit, how we would do this if we were, say, a fairly large organization existing on the west coast of the United States. And I'm not going to get any more detailed than that. We've got 3 states along the coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. And we also know from our previous videos that we happen to have data centers along the coast here, right? And these are specifically West US and West US 2. West 1 and West 2. 2 entirely separate regions with all the protections that those region separates afford us. Now, if we're building out our resource groups, we want to make sure that we make sense for our organization, right? Now, if our company has offices, say, a couple scattered about the area, right? We've got one in Washington, one in Oregon, maybe one over here in probably could be Idaho, maybe Montana, anyway, somewhere else. And we've got a couple in California, one in the south, one in the middle part, maybe one all the way down here south on top of our bird. Okay, that's our bird headquarters. So bird organization has a bunch of offices along the West Coast. We're obviously going to put our RGs in the locations that match our folk, right? We want to keep them as highly performed as possible, and we're going to serve our business customers, our peers, as best as we can. Now, we have to be smart about this. If we start, for instance, distributing things that need to communicate on a regular basis and are doing so best served in a high performance, low latency environment, we want to make sure that we're still sticking to the region. The region should still be the dominant focus, even though the resource group is something we have to pick first. We have to figure out where our resources are going. There's a bit of planning that's involved in this to do this intelligently. So here's an example of that in action. Say you had a project and it was going on in West 2. You're working out here and you build up a whole bunch of resources and everything's in a nice happy RG and everything's looking great. Your project is all nice and tidy on paper, right? However, you're getting a lot of extraneous bandwidth charges because one of your servers, which serves as a database warehousing server, it's providing some database manipulation purposes to the project, right? But the data it's coming from is over here. So this server, even though it's part of this project in the north, is constantly conversing across the region border to the south and back. And because we're crossing that, we got to pay the bandwidth charge. Wouldn't it make more sense, even if there were more transactions, like the number of conversations between these resources and this one right here, that might go up, but the total number of bandwidth and the cost would likely go down if this, rather than existing in an RG for the project, existed with the SQL servers down here in the West, where its function was primarily residing. This particular example is near and dear to my heart because of how many times the SQL servers go with the project, or the SQL servers go with the department, or the SQL servers go with the DBAs. That is a conversation, and usually it's not who gets it, it's who has to take it, because they're expensive and nobody wants the bill. Let's take a look at the Azure portal. If we log in there and we browse our way over to the resource groups, we can create one, kind of see what that looks like. Here's a few that you can see are actually existing in West US and West US 2. And we're going to go ahead and create a new one. And we're going to call it test RG00007. There we go. And let's call it Asia Pacific, Australia East. Why not? That sounds like an awesome place. Tags. We'll talk about these in the future, but I do tags. We'll talk about these in a future video. However, I want to point out, we had our little conversation about how we could end up with a conflict between who's organizing or who's going to be responsible. Sometimes it makes sense to just go with whatever makes sense from the billing perspective, and then we can use other methods like tags to organize things and keep track of things from projects and departments. So we've got more to go on. Don't worry, this isn't a black and white situation. You get lots of colorful gray area options that we get to work with for organization in Azure. Here we go. We're going to go ahead and create this. Takes just a moment. A resource group really is just a representation of a folder in your resource structure. And here it is right there. I didn't even get the second T. Boy, just typing a little fast. So there's Australia East RG. If we click on that, we can see how much is going on, which is very little. And we can also take a look at some of the functions we talked about. Here's the security recommendations from the security service. We'll talk about that more in the future. Here's our RBAC control services. Here's a few of the things that provide cost analysis of the resources within this RG. Let's see, here's one that's got some resources in it, what that looks like. Resource groups, pretty straightforward, but can be used in a lot of interesting, flexible ways. Definitely worth keeping an eye on. When you see that in an Azure certification exam, if they're talking about resource groups, consider the context, because just like it's a resource group doesn't mean a whole lot. It can do a lot. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.